1970, when this climb took place, we had sent men to the moon, and women hadn't stood on the highest points on Earth. And popular belief, are you guys ready for this, held, and this is 1970, remember, this isn't that long ago, it's pretty modern history. So popular belief held that they were physically and emotionally incapable of withstanding high altitudes and savage elements and carrying these heavy loads up storm-ravaged slopes day after day without men's help. And everyone knew, of course, that their periods made them weaker and prone to hysteria on a monthly basis. So, if this climb was such a big deal, like, why haven't we heard about it? The way that we know that Lynn Hill freed the nose in Yosemite in the early 90s, right? And by then, I've been writing about adventure, and specifically women's issues in adventure, for years. And I'm pretty well steeped in the mountain world, and I had never heard of this. And so, as I dove into the research, it became clear that this wasn't just the first all-women's ascent of Denali. It was the first all-women's ascent of any of the world's big peaks at all. And not only that, it was an improbable tale of survival. And somehow, despite all of that, it just faded away from our collective consciousness, escaped widespread notice. And one thing that attracted me to this story is something I want to invite you to think about right now, which is, how many adventure and exploration books can you name in the vein of Endurance, In the Thin Air, The Wager, that feature women? I would probably name her too.
Woman's Place.
Right, but would you call Arlene's mainstream? Maybe. Kind of more of a cult classic, right? Because how many other people have heard of Breaking Trail? And so still, and Arlene released that book in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think, and even then there was still, I think, so many barriers for women in mountaineering that Arlene's book didn't go mainstream when it should have, right? And so still, to this day, there is this void in the literary canon of strong and complex women, right? And we need stories that tell of female mettle, bravery, curiosity, impact, right? To know what we're capable of in the world, for how we see the world, what we know of it. And so the other thing, though, that I think is really interesting is that these women, as I dove into it, there are no clear-cut saints and sinners in this story. They are all complicated women on their own journeys. And that's the other thing that drew me to this, is that I think in 1970, and even still in some ways, women aren't really allowed to be complex. Often we're allowed to play the roles that we've historically been assigned. And we know what those are. It's lone heroine, damsel in distress, princess, witch. We're supposed to be likable, and we're villainized for being unlikable. And in this story, these are all just these real individuals on their own arcs of development, all with their own stakes, their own pressures, the own weight they were carrying up the mountain. But beyond the gender lens, it's just a damn good story, right? Like, the world doesn't read books like The Wager and Into Thin Air because they're male-focused stories. We read them because they're good adventure yarns, which is what I want this to be known as. So, this story begins, not in 1970, but 3 years before that, in 1967, with Alaskan climber Grace Holman, who ends up leading this 1970 climb. And that year in 1967, Grace was the only woman on an all-female expedition to summit Denali. And I just want to give you a snapshot of Grace's youth for you to understand what kind of woman she was. I could have written a whole book just on Grace Holman, a novel. You could write a novel based on her life. So she was raised in Holland, and at 21, she goes for a medical degree in Berlin in 1942, in the heart of World War II. She wants to be a surgeon at a time when less than 4% of doctors are women. And that was just the best university, so she gets herself to Berlin. There, she falls in love with a fellow doctor. They get married, they have a child. He's conscripted as a battlefield doctor, and he's shot in combat when their daughter's 2 years old, and Grace is pregnant with their second child. So Grace is finishing out her medical degree while single parenting a 2-year-old, gives birth to her second child, and then Grace's mother hops on a bike from Holland, cycles into wartime Germany, finds a bike for Grace, and they just cycle the 2 little girls out of Third Reich Berlin, which is insane. Right? Like, that alone could be a movie. And And here I just want to pause. How many of you have climbed Denali? Of course, there's that. He's skied all the time. And you guys who have climbed it, when did you climb it?
First time 85.
And in 1970, as you'll see in some of those photos, the way that people climbed mountains was to carry these just like huge loads and leapfrog it all up. And the gear is so heavy, and you look at these snowshoes are like 3 feet long and wood and so unwieldy. So they're doing this, and for those of you who have not climbed Denali, I just want to give you a little hint of what makes it a really difficult climb. I have friends who are accomplished mountaineers who say that their time on Denali was the most miserable of their entire climbing career. And part of that is that, so we all know that Denali is the highest mountain in North America, right? So it scrapes the Alaskan sky at over 20,000 feet. And these huge glaciers flow down all of its sides, some of them reaching up to 50 miles. And it's surrounded in these 17,000-foot peaks, most of them unclimbed in 1967 when Grace is doing this, and all of them just dwarfed by this astonishing mass of Denali. And it's why, in every language of the Athabascan people living near the mountain, its name is similar. The tall one, the high one, the great one. And it rises from this low plateau that's just 2,000 feet above sea level, which means that from its base, it gains 18,000 feet, which is a full 6,000 more feet than Everest gains from its base. And so what that means is it requires climbers to be on the mountain for longer to acclimatize to that intense elevation gain, right? And what that also means is it exposes them to this frequently fierce weather that Denali is subject to. So it's the highest polar mountain, which means its air is thin like Everest, even though it doesn't rise as high. And where it sits close to the coast, it gets these just quicksilver fast, bitingly cold storms out of nowhere. And so to this day, of the people who attempt to climb Denali, less than half make it to the top, which is fewer than on Everest. And since people started climbing it in 1903, more than 100 people have died on it, and more than 30 of their bodies are still on the mountain. So that's Denali. And then imagine it in 1970, when there wasn't much weather forecasting, radio connectivity was really sketchy if it existed at all, and you were carrying just the most heavy, insane gear up this peak, over and over and over. So this is where we are.